Bhutan, one of the most isolated and mysterious places on Earth. But what if I told you that it's not just its towering mountains or ancient traditions that make it unique? There's something hidden, something beneath the surface. It's DNA. Scientists have uncovered something extraordinary about Bhutanese genetics, something that sets them apart from the rest of the world. The question is, why is Bhutanese DNA so different? For centuries, the Himalayas have acted as a natural fortress, cutting Bhutan off from the outside world. Unlike its neighbors, India, Nepal, and Tibet, Bhutan never saw large-scale migrations or foreign invasions. While other regions mixed and evolved with waves of new populations, Bhutan remained untouched, its gene pool locked away like a hidden treasure. And the result? A genetic signature unlike any other. Recent studies have found that Bhutanese people share a rare Y chromosome haplogroup called DM174, a marker found mostly in Tibet, Japan, and the Andaman Islands. It's almost non-existent elsewhere. What does this mean? It suggests that Bhutan's ancestors were part of an ancient migration that few populations on Earth can trace back to. But that's not all. While Nepalese DNA shows heavy influences from India, Bhutanese DNA does not. Despite being geographically close, their genetic makeup tells a completely different story, one that is much closer to Tibet and East Asia. Even within Bhutan, the diversity is fascinating. The country has multiple ethnic groups, Ngalip, Sharchap, Lhotshampa, but their genetic differences are surprisingly small. Over 97% of their genetic variation exists within individuals rather than between groups. That's extremely rare. In most places, different ethnic groups have significant genetic distinctions. But Bhutan, its people share a level of genetic unity that is almost unheard of. And then there's the real game changer, altitude adaptation. Bhutanese people thrive at extreme elevations, where most would struggle to breathe. This isn't just because they've lived there for generations, it's in their DNA. Scientists have discovered that Bhutanese people, like Tibetans and Sherpas, carry a mutation in the EPS1 gene, often called the superathlete gene. This gene helps them process oxygen more efficiently, allowing them to survive in thin air. But here's the real shocker. This gene isn't entirely human. It comes from an ancient, now extinct human ancestor, the Denisovans. That's right. Bhutanese DNA carries a genetic signature from a species that vanished tens of thousands of years ago. But why has Bhutan's genetic identity remained so intact? Unlike Nepal or Tibet, where outside influences left strong genetic imprints, Bhutan maintained strict societal controls. Elite families, monastic rulers, and a deep-rooted spiritual system carefully managed intermarriage, ensuring that Bhutan's genetic makeup stayed largely unchanged for centuries. In a way, Bhutan has done something almost no other country has. It has preserved a biological time capsule of ancient human history. So what does all this mean? Bhutan's DNA is a genetic mystery, a living testament to ancient migrations, extreme survival, and one of the most isolated gene pools in the world. Science is only just beginning to uncover its secrets. The real question is, could Bhutan's genetics hold the key to understanding human evolution in the harshest environments on Earth? Bhutan's genetic mystery doesn't just stop at its isolation. It goes even deeper, into something even more fascinating, its connection to ancient migrations. While the rest of the world evolved through centuries of intermixing, Bhutan remained locked in time, preserving an ancestral lineage that scientists are still trying to unravel. The big question is, where did the Bhutanese people originally come from? Genetic studies suggest an unexpected answer. Despite being surrounded by South Asian populations, Bhutanese DNA tells a different story, one that begins in Northeast Asia. Thousands of years ago, a wave of people moved southward from what is now Mongolia, northern China, and Siberia. These ancient travelers, speakers of Tibeto-Burman languages, settled across the Himalayas, bringing with them unique genetic traits found nowhere else in the world. But not all of them stayed together. As they spread, some took a path toward Tibet, some toward northeast India, and some toward Bhutan. Over time, these groups developed genetic differences, but Bhutan remained the most isolated of them all. This is why today, while Tibetans, Northeast Indians, and Nepalese show clear genetic mixing, Bhutanese DNA remains one of the purest links to these ancient migrations. And then there's the Denisovan Connection. While most of the world carries genes inherited from Neanderthals, Bhutanese DNA carries something much rarer. A unique genetic imprint from Denisovans, an extinct human species that once roamed the mountains of Central Asia. This genetic signature isn't just a relic of the past. It gives Bhutanese people a natural advantage at high altitudes, allowing them to thrive where oxygen levels are dangerously low. This means that deep inside their DNA, Bhutanese people are carrying the survival secrets of an ancient, lost branch of humanity. But here's where things get even more surprising. Bhutan's genetic ties extend far beyond the Himalayas. Specific DNA markers found in Bhutanese people also appear in Japan and the Andaman Islands. How is that possible? Scientists believe it points to an ancient coastal migration route, where early humans traveled by sea from mainland Asia, hopping across islands before reaching the Himalayas. This suggests that Bhutan's ancestors weren't just high-altitude settlers. They were part of a massive prehistoric movement that shaped entire civilizations. Despite this deep genetic history, modern Bhutanese people show remarkably low genetic differentiation among themselves. Even though the country is home to multiple ethnic groups, Gallup, Sharchap, and Lot Shampa, their overall genetic structure remains highly unified. This is incredibly rare. In most countries, different ethnic groups show significant genetic variation, but Bhutan's centuries of social cohesion and controlled intermarriage have preserved a level of genetic homogeneity that scientists rarely see in human populations. So what does this all mean? Bhutan is not just a country. It's a genetic time capsule. It holds one of the last remaining links to ancient Himalayan migrations, carrying DNA from a lost human species and maintaining a genetic purity that few other nations can claim. This isn't just about history. It's about understanding how ancient humans adapted, survived, and thrived in some of the most extreme environments on Earth. For centuries, Bhutan has remained an enigma, a land hidden behind towering peaks, a nation untouched by colonial rule, and a people whose DNA carries secrets that scientists are only now beginning to decode. While most of the world's populations show clear signs of mixing over thousands of years, Bhutan stands apart, preserving genetic traits that remain almost entirely unique. But why? The answer lies in the Himalayan barrier. Unlike most regions that saw constant migrations and invasions, Bhutan's extreme geography acted as a natural shield, preventing large-scale genetic mixing. This isolation didn't just preserve Bhutanese culture. It locked in genetic markers that are incredibly rare anywhere else in the world. Scientists studying Bhutan's DNA have found that while nearby populations like Nepalese and Tibetans show strong genetic influence from South Asia, Bhutanese people exhibit a distinct genetic profile, one that has remained remarkably stable for centuries. But isolation alone isn't the full story. Bhutan's genetics also reveal a hidden history of selection and survival. Living at extreme altitudes is no easy feat, yet Bhutanese people show a rare adaptation that allows them to thrive where most humans would struggle. Unlike populations that rely on higher hemoglobin levels to compensate for low oxygen, Bhutanese people have evolved a more efficient way to utilize oxygen, preventing the dangerous side effects that plague lowlanders at high altitudes. This adaptation is not found in all Himalayan populations, further proving that Bhutanese genetics are truly in a category of their own. Another major factor in Bhutan's genetic uniqueness is its controlled population structure. Unlike other regions where frequent wars and invasions caused massive shifts in demographics, Bhutan has maintained a tightly knit social system for centuries. Traditional laws discourage marriage outside specific groups, and strict lineage records ensured that ancestral heritage was preserved. Even today, Bhutan has one of the lowest recorded levels of genetic diversity within its ethnic groups, a trait that has fascinated geneticists worldwide. But here's where things take a surprising turn. Bhutanese DNA holds connections to both the past and the future. On one hand, it preserves one of the purest links to ancient Tibeto-Burman ancestors, offering scientists a window into the genetic history of the region. On the other, these genetic adaptations could hold the key to modern medical breakthroughs. Studies on Bhutanese high-altitude adaptations are already inspiring research on how to treat conditions like hypoxia and heart disease. What was once an isolated genetic trait may soon help millions of people worldwide. In the end, Bhutan's DNA is not just a product of history. It's a blueprint for survival, a genetic legacy shaped by nature, geography, and time. It's proof that sometimes isolation doesn't just preserve a culture. It creates something entirely new. For centuries, Bhutan has stood as a genetic outlier. But what if its DNA doesn't just preserve the past, but also tells a deeper story of human migration and evolution? The latest genetic studies suggest that the ancestors of the Bhutanese people didn't arrive in one great migration. Instead, they came in waves, shaped by geography, climate, and even language. DNA evidence points to a Northeast Asian origin for many Bhutanese groups, particularly the Ngalops and the Sharchops. But here's where things get fascinating. Not all of Bhutan's genetic heritage comes from the same source. The high-altitude adaptations found in Bhutanese DNA share similarities with Tibetan populations, yet the genetic influence from South Asia is significantly lower than expected. Unlike Nepalese groups, who show strong traces of Indian ancestry, Bhutanese DNA remains surprisingly distinct. This suggests that even though Bhutan shares borders with both Tibet and India, its genetic identity has remained largely separate, almost like a time capsule of an ancient population. But genetic uniqueness isn't just about ancestry. It's about how populations evolve over time. The Bhutanese genome shows signs of natural selection, particularly in genes related to high-altitude survival. What's even more astonishing is that these adaptations appear more refined than those found in many other Himalayan groups. Scientists believe this could be due to generations of selective pressure. Only those best suited to the extreme conditions of Bhutan's mountains could pass on their genes. This means that Bhutanese DNA isn't just unique, it's specialized. Another key factor shaping Bhutan's genetic diversity is its linguistic and cultural history. Unlike many nations where genetic boundaries align with political borders, Bhutan's different ethnic groups show varying levels of genetic separation. The Ngalops, often considered the political and cultural elite, share closer genetic ties to Tibetans, while the Sharchops, historically seen as Bhutan's original inhabitants, exhibit unique genetic markers that set them apart from both their Tibetan and Indian neighbors. Meanwhile, the Lot Shampa, a group of Nepalese descent, introduce another layer of genetic complexity, showing how recent migrations have added diversity to Bhutan's gene pool. But here's the real question. How much longer will Bhutan's genetic identity remain distinct? With modernization, global travel, and increasing intermarriage, the genetic patterns that have remained stable for centuries may begin to shift. Scientists believe Bhutan is at a crossroads. Will it maintain its rare genetic blueprint, or will the forces of globalization gradually dissolve what has taken thousands of years to shape? Imagine living in one of the most isolated regions on Earth, where the towering Himalayas dictate every aspect of survival. What if your DNA had to adapt to one of the harshest environments known to humankind? This is exactly what happened in Bhutan. But here's the twist. The genetic adaptations seen in Bhutanese people aren't just about surviving at high altitudes. They reveal a much deeper story of evolution, endurance, and resilience. Scientists have identified unique genetic markers in Bhutanese DNA that are rarely found elsewhere. These markers help the body efficiently process oxygen in thin mountain air, reducing the risk of altitude sickness. But unlike other high-altitude populations, such as the Andeans or Ethiopians, Bhutanese people show a genetic adaptation more closely linked to Tibetans. This means that the ability to thrive in extreme altitudes isn't something that developed independently in Bhutan. It was likely inherited from an ancient Himalayan ancestor. But genetics isn't just about adaptation, it's also about resistance. Studies show that Bhutanese DNA carries traces of immunity-related genes that suggest exposure to specific pathogens over centuries. This indicates that Bhutan's populations have faced waves of diseases throughout history, likely introduced by trade and migration. Over time, those with stronger immunity survived, shaping a genetic profile uniquely resistant to certain infections. This genetic filtering process might explain why some diseases, common in other parts of South Asia, have lower prevalence rates in Bhutan. And then there's diet, a factor often overlooked in genetic evolution. Bhutanese cuisine is rich in dairy, particularly yak milk, yet lactose intolerance is lower than expected for an Asian population. This suggests that generations of dairy consumption may have influenced Bhutanese genetics, favoring those with stronger lactose processing abilities. In contrast, high-altitude crops like buckwheat and barley have also played a role, with some genes associated with carbohydrate metabolism showing slight modifications, possibly to help digest the unique mountain diet more efficiently. But here's the real game changer. Modernization is slowly reshaping these genetic advantages. As Bhutan opens up to global influences, diet, lifestyle, and even disease exposure are changing. Will the adaptations that took centuries to perfect become less relevant? Or will they continue to evolve in new ways, ensuring Bhutanese people remain genetically distinct in the future? For centuries, Bhutan has remained an enigma, a land untouched by colonial rule, hidden in the Himalayas and steeped in traditions passed down through generations. But beneath its cultural uniqueness lies something even more fascinating: its genetic connections to populations that, on the surface, seem worlds apart. How did this happen? Bhutanese DNA tells a story of migration, adaptation, and unexpected ancestry. Despite Bhutan's geographic isolation, genetic studies reveal traces of Northeast Asian ancestry, particularly linked to Tibetans, Mongols, and even ancient Siberians. This suggests that the ancestors of modern Bhutanese people were once part of an expansive migration wave that traveled across Asia thousands of years ago. But there's another twist. South Asian genetic influence is also present, particularly in populations from the southern and central regions of Bhutan. This aligns with historical accounts of trade and interaction between Bhutan and the Indian subcontinent. However, the genetic impact isn't uniform. While some Bhutanese groups show strong links to Indo-Aryan populations, others have almost none. This selective genetic mixing suggests that geography played a crucial role in shaping Bhutan's human diversity, acting as both a bridge and a barrier. And then there's something truly unexpected. Bhutanese DNA carries small but significant similarities to certain Southeast Asian groups. Could this mean that ancient migration patterns were more complex than previously thought? Some researchers believe that long-forgotten trade routes, possibly linked to early Buddhist monks or Silk Road merchants, may have brought distant populations into contact, leaving behind subtle genetic imprints. But perhaps the most astonishing revelation is Bhutan's genetic stability. Unlike other populations that have undergone dramatic genetic shifts due to conquest, colonization, or mass migration, Bhutan's core genetic identity has remained remarkably intact. This suggests that despite interactions with various groups, the Bhutanese gene pool has been shaped by selection rather than replacement, a rare phenomenon in human history. As science continues to unlock the secrets hidden in Bhutanese DNA, one question remains: how many more unexpected connections are waiting to be discovered? Deep in the Himalayas, Bhutan has stood like a fortress against time. Unlike other regions, shaped by waves of conquests, colonization, and mass migrations, Bhutan has remained uniquely untouched. But does this cultural isolation extend to its DNA? What if Bhutan's genetic code holds secrets about survival in one of the world's most challenging landscapes? Recent genetic studies have revealed something remarkable. Bhutanese DNA has remained surprisingly stable for centuries. While other populations in Asia show clear signs of genetic mixing due to large-scale movements of people, Bhutan's core genetic structure has stayed intact. Why? The answer lies in the country's geography, history, and deeply ingrained traditions. The towering Himalayas have served as a natural barrier, limiting external influence and reducing genetic drift. Unlike regions where conquerors left behind genetic imprints, Bhutan's remote valleys have protected its gene pool from being diluted. Even when trade and cultural exchange took place, the genetic exchange remained minimal. This has resulted in something rare: a population with a deep ancestral connection to its past, relatively unchanged over thousands of years. But Bhutan's isolation wasn't just about mountains. Strict social structures and cultural practices played an equally important role. The Bhutanese people historically followed endogamous marriage traditions, meaning they mostly married within their own communities. This reinforced genetic continuity and prevented the kind of widespread mixing seen in neighboring regions. Another factor: Bhutan's controlled approach to modernization. Unlike many nations that opened their borders rapidly, Bhutan has taken a slow, deliberate path. Even today, immigration is heavily restricted, preserving both cultural identity and genetic heritage. But here's the real question. Does Bhutan's genetic isolation mean its people are entirely cut off from the rest of the world? Not at all. While their core DNA has remained consistent, subtle traces of interactions with neighboring populations can still be detected. These small genetic exchanges show that Bhutan's history wasn't one of complete isolation, but rather selective interaction. In a world where genetic identities are constantly shifting, Bhutan stands as a rare example of how geography, culture, and careful governance can preserve a population's unique lineage. But with increasing globalization, how long can this genetic isolation last? Bhutan has preserved its unique genetic identity for centuries. But can it stay the same forever? What happens when a genetically distinct population begins to interact with the modern world at an unprecedented pace? For the longest time, Bhutan's geography and cultural traditions acted as a protective shield, limiting external genetic influence. But today, things are changing. Increased urbanization, improved infrastructure, and rising global connectivity are slowly altering the country's demographic landscape. What does this mean for Bhutanese DNA? One of the biggest factors influencing genetic shifts is migration. While Bhutan still controls immigration strictly, younger generations are moving to cities, pursuing education abroad, and forming relationships outside their traditional communities. Could this lead to the first major genetic shifts in Bhutan's history? Scientific research suggests that genetic diversity can be both a challenge and an advantage. On one hand, a stable gene pool has helped Bhutanese people retain strong adaptations to their environment. But on the other, genetic mixing has historically led to increased immunity to diseases and greater biological resilience. If Bhutan's genetic makeup starts to diversify, will it be for the better or worse? There's also the question of climate change. As global temperatures rise, Bhutan's mountainous environment is becoming more unpredictable. Could genetic traits that have helped Bhutanese people survive in high-altitude conditions for centuries be tested in new ways? Some scientists believe that as Bhutan adapts to climate shifts, its population might experience slow but noticeable biological changes over generations. The future of Bhutanese genetics isn't just about science, it's about the choices Bhutanese people make. Will they continue to prioritize cultural and genetic preservation? Or will modernization bring an unavoidable transformation? The answer isn't clear yet, but one thing is certain. Bhutan is at a crossroads where the past and future are colliding in ways never seen before.